Greeting Training for Translators listeners. This is Corinne McKay, and a very warm welcome to episode 28 of the Training for Translators podcast, in which we're going to close out this Training for Translators school year. Then I'm going to take a couple of weeks off, and the newsletter and the podcast will be back in September. And if you're listening to this podcast and you are not yet subscribed to my newsletter, you should be, because the podcast is based on the newsletter. So I know you would enjoy it. So here we are with episode 28. Help! I lost my biggest client with no warning. So, in this blog post, which I published on my website, trainingfortranslators.com, on July 21st, 2026, I did note that Training for Translators had a fantastic first half of the year: 5,007 newsletter subscribers and 1,254 registrations for Training for Translators classes. Of course, some or maybe even a lot of those are the same person who takes multiple classes, but I really appreciate every single one of you. And if you want to look at what we have on tap for the next school year, just hop over to trainingfortranslators.com. Right now, I have a self-paced LinkedIn class going on that's open until September 10th, and then we'll do a live question and answer session. I'm going to be writing the 20th anniversary edition of How to Succeed as a Freelance Translator, and then we'll start again with classes in September, and I'm going to be launching a Training for Translators Plus tier. Don't worry, the free stuff is staying exactly the same. This is just an option for people who want some mentoring and targeted mini courses. But let's get to our topic. In my opinion, there are two kinds of freelancers in the world: those who have already lost a major client with no warning, and those who are going to, at some point in the future, lose a major client with no warning. It is just the reality of freelancing, especially in these crazy times we are living through. And I was actually inspired to write this blog post and record this podcast because in 1 week, I saw 2 LinkedIn posts by translators who, these are written translators, although it could happen to an interpreter as well, who had lost their major client with absolutely no warning. Client just sent them an email and said, "Thanks for your work. We're done." And in one of those cases, it was a translator who was part of a translator collective, and they had a client that represented 2/3 of their work that they lost with no warning. So here was my brutal introduction to this reality, and I'm going to estimate that this was in about 2010. So quite some time ago, but it is still firmly engraved in my memory. My big direct client at that time was a private university in France. This university, and if you would like to steal this idea for marketing, I no longer work in this niche, but you could. Many private universities in Europe have international programs that they teach in English. So, for example, this particular university in France had an internationally accredited MBA, Master's in Business Administration program. And into this program, like many European private universities, they accepted and even recruited students who did not speak a word of French. So, for those students, the school had to translate. Not only did they have to offer courses in English, but absolutely everything had to be translated: how to register for classes, how to find a place to live, how to eat in the school cafeteria, how to get on the Wi Fi. And this was all pre ChatGPT, so all of this was translated by hand. I loved the work. They paid really well, and they were, for me at the time, a big client. And around the beginning of every school year, they would have these peaks of work, translating the course descriptions and all kinds of things like that. Then one day, I opened up my email. They're 8 hours ahead of me, so I would always get email from them first thing in the morning. And they sent me an email that read something like this: "Hello, Corinne. Thanks so much for all of your work for us over the years. We've really enjoyed the collaboration. Just wanted to let you know that we've hired a new communications specialist for our office. That person is bilingual in French and English and has also worked as a translator. She'll be handling our translation needs from now on, but we'll certainly keep you in mind if any additional needs arise." Oh my gosh, I read that email and my heart just dropped. That was a significant percentage of my income. It was a big blow to my business confidence because I didn't have that many direct clients at the time, and it had honestly kind of never occurred to me that this kind of thing had happened. I'm not sure whether being still kind of a new-ish. I had been freelancing, like 7 years, 8 years at that time and was relatively new to the direct client market because I worked mostly with agencies for the first 5, 6 years that I was a translator. And I had honestly never thought about this possibility. I'm not sure whether I thought I would translate for the same clients forever or whether I they would give me some warning, you know? I'm not sure what I was going to have what I thought was going to happen, but that's what did happen. These days, I honestly think that there are a lot of translators who are getting a version of this really devastating email, but it's because they're being replaced in many cases by AI, or they just don't know what they're being replaced with, but the volume of work drops off completely. So I did recently did if you're on my mailing list, you received my survey about the current state of your freelance business. And many people, when I asked if they had lost a client to AI, said, I'm not positive whether or not it was because of AI, but I have lost a big client in the past few years. So, as I mentioned, LinkedIn is kind of exploding with some version of this story. Big client disappears overnight. Now, what do I do? This situation led me to observe 5 things, and I'm going to give you those tips and talk about them a little bit. I think the most important thing is when you have a dominant client, really be aware of the risks and benefits and what you're getting yourself into. I am honestly not against dominant clients because they give you consistent work. They have less administrative overhead. You get to know their people and processes. And if you have somewhat of a retainer situation, like I have a couple of translation companies as writing clients that are basically, I don't have a formal retainer agreement with them, but I have an informal agreement for things I write for them every month, like their blog, ghostwriting, the CEO's LinkedIn, things like that. And it's really, really nice to have that consistent work and not be starting like every month at 0 the way you are when you only do one-off projects. But there are big risks, and the main one being that you might see a quarter or half, or in the case of this person who posted on LinkedIn, two-thirds of your income disappearing with one email. A dominant client is not necessarily the wrong thing, but here's what I think you need to do. You need a business savings account that measures up to the level of risk you are taking with that client. And here's what I would do. I just honestly kind of made this up, but I do think it's valid. Figure that for every 10% of your income that that client represents, that it's probably going to take you a month of marketing to replace them and round up. So, for example, if you have a client that represents 25% of your income, figure that you need 3 months of reserves in savings in case they dump you. So, I'm going to pause here and comment on what I do with my business savings account and why I think 25% is kind of a good limit to have with a dominant client. So I actually keep about 3 months of reserves in my business accounts just as a rainy day fund that I sort of figure. So my salary plus my taxes are about $7,000 a month, 7,000 US a month, and I try to keep about $20,000 in my business savings account because I figure that if I lost a big client overnight or anything else happened, I got sick and couldn't work, one of my immediate family members really needed me, that I could either not work at all for 3 months or I could get cut back to half time for 6 months, or I could just stretch that money maybe even longer than that. Like I've lived, very frugally at certain points in my life. And so for me, 20,000 US dollars is a cushion that I feel pretty secure with. But here's what I think is the hard part. If we use my estimate, so let's say that this person who lost the client that was two-thirds of their income, that's 66%. And I recommended rounding up. So now we need 7 months of reserves in our business savings account. Now, for me, that would be almost 50,000 US dollars. And however much that represents for you, I just think that the hard part is that for most of us, building up and maintaining a reserve of 7 months of business expenses, including our own salary, is number one, difficult to build up. And number two, difficult to just look at it and not spend it. I think even though I'm a very frugal person, it would take me a pretty long time. And I do keep other savings in my personal accounts, but it would take me a pretty long time to build up to $49,000 in my business savings account. And then I think the really hard part, just emotionally, and I say this even as a very frugal person, you have this pretty huge chunk of money that you're sitting there staring at and thinking, well, what else could I be doing with that? Right? I could take a really great vacation. I could do some work on my house. I could do all kinds of things with that. So that's why I think that not letting any one client represent more than 25% of your income and keeping 3 months of reserves in savings is for most of us a pretty good guideline. So that is observation number one. Observation number two, if you have gotten dumped by a client, decide right then, before you start marketing to new clients, how much of your time or income you're willing to give to one client in the future. I commented here again in the spirit of don't take more work from a client than you can afford to lose overnight. That I would recommend to someone who has lost, 50%, 60% of their income. I would recommend deciding right now that going forward, you're going to stick to the 25% rule. The next two observations I got from my past business coach, Teresa Edmond, and her website is bossresponses.com. She has written newsletter articles about about these topics in the recent past. Next, you really, really need to think about how clients are buying what you do right now, not how they bought it in the past. I think, particularly for those who do exclusively written translation, the way that you sold translation services even a year ago is really, really different from now. And it's really, really, really different than how you sold translations before ChatGPT existed, which takes me to Teresa's next comment, which is observation four. One thing that she pointed out, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that especially if you do purely written translation, strategy and implementation are becoming much more important than pure execution. Or if you follow Ed Gandia, he calls this order taking. I think that sounds a little bit dismissive, but I think all of us get the point that doing French word equals English word is what we might call pure execution or order taking. Sadly, I think a lot of clients these days have decided that AI translations aren't perfect, but they're good enough, and that a good enough translation that they got from for free from ChatGPT fits their needs. But the thing is that I think it is a lot harder to compare you to ChatGPT if you're selling more than words. My friend and colleague Tess Whitty posted on LinkedIn this week something that I thought was really interesting. So she does English into Swedish and said, if you just want to know what something says in another language, ChatGPT has gotten pretty good. But the human judgment role has gotten a lot more important. Would a native speaker say it this way? Does this call to action make sense in this context? Is this the way you sell to people in this particular culture? And I think what all of us have to get used to doing is emphasize the results and benefits of our work. So the last training for translators class of the year was guest instructor Lee Densmer, who taught a content marketing class, and she suggested using wording like, I help clients avoid costly and embarrassing mistakes when they're entering the German market. I make sure that your brand voice comes through in Japanese. So I can't stress that enough that you need to think about those two things. How are clients buying your services right now, particularly if you do purely written translation? And how can you get more on the human judgment strategy implementation side than just the execution side? And I will close by saying I think that when you lose a major client, The hardest, but maybe the most important thing is to really, really try to embrace it as an opportunity to reinvent. Losing a big client can be incredibly stressful. It can be a huge financial hit, a big blow to your confidence, and it also gives you a clean slate to start from. You don't have much to lose when you've suddenly lost a lot of work. So think about, what would you love to be doing? What kind of work would put you in that financial position where you have a big chunk of savings ready for the next time this happens? And I will say again, going back to the survey of my newsletter community that I just did, that when I asked about people's feelings about the AI onslaught, one of the options that I offered was, the AI transition has been a lot to deal with, but it's also forced me to rethink the way I want to work. And I was surprised that that was one of the most popular responses. So I think losing a major client is the same way. You have to acknowledge that, particularly if you don't have a lot of money in business savings, it can be tremendously stressful to be thinking, like, okay, I can get through this month, but what about next month? And at the same time, it also gives you that opportunity to rethink how you want to work and who you want to work for. Okay, thank you. This has been episode 10 of, or excuse me, episode 28 of the Training for Translators podcast. I'm your host, Corinne McKay. I record this podcast on a Shure MV7 Plus microphone in Audacity. I host it on Libsyn. And if you'd like more information about Training for Translators, newsletters, classes, or if you'd like to read more than 1,500 posts for free on my blog, visit trainingfortranslators.com. Thanks, and I'll talk to you in a future episode.